And I think we're going to begin as we always do. I don't know why I keep saying think. We're going to start with, as we always do, which is the Notre Dame rushing offense against the USC rushing defense. And Ryan, as we talked before, there's going to be some good on good matchups. This is not one of those. This is not a good on good matchup. This is a good on not very good matchup. And, you look at this and the numbers aren't super different from a yards to, a yard standpoint. There's obviously big jumps in yards per attempt and touchdowns. USC's rushing defense gives up a lot of yards per attempt and a lot of touchdowns on the ground. Yards, it's not a huge difference. But when you look at Notre Dame, I think that the Notre Dame ranking is a little bit misleading as to what this Notre Dame team is now. Right. And I think we can say with one minor hiccup, that would be against Navy, which was still a very bizarre game. Notre Dame's ground attack really the last 2 months has been outstanding. Yep. Because you're talking about a team, Ryan, that in the first game of the year rushed for 76 yards. The next game of the year rushed for, 130 yards. The next game, they rushed for 147 yards. And as we talked then, wow, this team is really struggling to be what we thought it was going to be. They broke out on September 24th against North Carolina with 287 rushing yards in that game. That began a stretch of 8 games in which Notre Dame rushed for at least 223 yards in 6 of the next 8 games. And Notre Dame is currently averaging 218.1 yards per game over the last 8 games. So, again, it's not like, hey, they're in the middle of a 3-game hot streak. This is now an 8-game stretch in which Notre Dame has been this team. And I think I think that's more indicative of who they are. And if you look at that ranking right there, 218 yards a game, it would put them 13th in the country in rushing offense. Right. I think that's more indicative of who this offense is. And, of course, there's 3 option teams ahead of them. I think that's more indicative than even those numbers, in my opinion, what those numbers show. So I think that's something to keep when you talk about context. I think that's a very important part of the context of who this team is when you look at just from a Notre Dame offensive standpoint.
Well, and I will say this, because I agree with you 100%, right? Notre Dame's rushing offense has been the backbone of this team during the stretch that they've now been able to put together and the success that they've had over the last few games. You're coming now to the crossroads where this is why Notre Dame is successful. This is the identity of this football team. Everyone knows it. Notre Dame knows it. And you have to live that, right? You have to be proud of how you win, especially offensively right now. That's how you win. And Brian, when you're faced off against a USC team, I know we've talked about this before, but I can't stand Alex Grinch's defense. I really can't, man. Structurally, from a run game perspective, it's not pretty, man. And it's never really been pretty. He had one great year at Washington State, one phenomenal year where Hercules Mataafa was an All-American and everything was cooking that year. Oklahoma was very inconsistent. USC has also been very inconsistent. This is not a great rushing defense. They have a couple names in their front 7 that people are going to know and the people should know that are good football players. But for the most part, I think that the defense, it needs to get more talented for sure. It needs to, especially in the front 7.
Right.
But it's also, I think this is a product of what we've seen from Alex Grinch, right? He's a master of chaos, but being a master of chaos also means that you leave other spots out to dry a lot, and it's structurally unsound. And that's the issues that I have most seen with the USC rush defense, is that there's just guys that just aren't in the right spot a lot, which is maddening for them.
They give up gash plays. I mean, there's plays where you're just like, man, boy, that was a great series. They just came out, they were filling gaps, they shut that team down, and then the next series it's like 15, 9, 25, 13, 40-yard touchdown. How did that team do that when the last series they looked as good as they were? And look, we have I don't know if Archer's in the show with us today, but Archer had Ohio State fans will tell you the same thing. I mean, they could not stand him in a very short period of time at Ohio State because it was a lot of the same thing. It's a very aggressive defense. It's a really let's try to create negatives type of defense. And that's why when you look at it, kind of looking ahead, we'll see some things about this defense. There's a couple areas about this defense that are very good statistically. If you just take those statistics in a vacuum. And they're very good in sacks. They're very good in tackles for loss. They're very good at turnovers. But the way they go about it puts them such at risk of getting gashed in so many other areas. And it's really the thing about it, the reason people say, why does Lincoln Riley put up with that? Because that's what Lincoln Riley wants. He doesn't care about having a defense that stops the rushing attack. He wants a defense that's going to force stops however you get them. I just need you to give me 2 to 3 stops a game and we won't lose.
And opportunistic turnovers
right,
is a big thing for Lincoln as well. Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of what they do. So I don't think he necessarily has a problem with this, honestly, because it was the same thing at Oklahoma.
Yep.
And so it's gonna make this matchup interesting, because also if you look at the last 8 games for Notre Dame as well, they're averaging 5.0 yards per rush, which also obviously puts them a little bit higher than where they are now. That would put them tied for 26 with BYU in yards per attempt, and so we're seeing them start, however, the last 3 games to be a little bit more big play in their run game.
Yep.
And this is going to be a thing in this game, Ryan, where you're going to need to see that. You're going to need to see 2 things from the Notre Dame ground attack: efficiency and rip off some big plays. That's going to be a very key. And first down run game success is going to be huge in this game, because you're going to need to be able to sometimes match USC with scores, and the ground attack is going to be key to that. And when you look at USC, Ryan, also the other aspect of it is they don't really have a lot of bad games on defense. Like, they don't have that – that performance like Notre Dame's had a couple games like that where it's like, 255 against Navy, and you're like, wow, that's a lot of yards. Or, like last year, for example, when they gave up 264 in the opener against Florida State. Their most yards they've only given up over 200 yards this year twice. That was in week 2 to Stanford, and then last week to UCLA, and the Stanford game was 221 yards.
Yeah.
So they're consistently giving up yards to teams, 146, 221, 164, 153, 88, 144, 138, 163, 63, 135, 204. So it is interesting to see how they do it. And then also, as we'll get into the pass defense, like, they're not real good in that area either. And I think part of it too is when you look at their numbers, that people have to understand is the reason their rushing numbers don't match the other parts is because a lot of teams in the Pac-12 don't run the football.
Right.
And if you look at the numbers, Ryan, it's very strange. We were having this conversation on the message board yesterday, about USC's rush defense. UCLA is averaging 236.8 yards a game. Oregon's averaging 223 yards a game. Utah's averaging 205. Oregon State's averaging 192. And then USC's next. Then there's this huge drop-off to USC's 5th. Then there's this huge drop-off to number 6. Washington's at 138.9, then 132.9, 131.6, 115.4, 112.6, 112.3, and then 99.3.
Who's 99.3?
Cal.
Ugh.
And then Stanford's right above them. And if you look at USC's schedule, they've played every team from 7 to 12. They didn't play Washington at number 6. They didn't play Oregon at number 2. So, a couple of those good rushing teams they didn't play. Now, they did have some success. If you look at their game against Utah, they had some success running the football that game. But I felt, and you tell me if you disagree, they so overcommitted to trying to stop the run that allowed them to get kind of ripped up with some big plays in the pass game. And that ultimately is what cost them the game. So they haven't shown the ability to stop the run without then sacrificing other parts of their defense. And I think that's what makes them vulnerable is if you can establish your ground attack against USC, you're going to have a chance to score some points. There's no doubt about it.
Also, you want to talk about polar opposites, Brian? This team, to stop the run, is Notre Dame is a very downhill, physical run style, right? USC wants to stop the run with movement, like you're talking about, right? Like, they'll take Eric Gentry, who is like 6'6", 200 pounds at linebacker, line him up all over the place. They'll take Tuipulotu. I don't know how to pronounce his name. My deepest apologies to Tuli, who's a very good player, by the way. Number 49.
Just call him Tuli. Just do what I do with DJ. Just call him
Tuli.
DJ.
All right. Tuli who is a 6'4", 290-pound guy that plays mostly defensive end in their system, because they play like kind of a hybrid 3-man, 4-man fronts. They'll kind of rotate a little bit. But the master of chaos, right? They did this against UCLA, at least. I saw a bunch. they took Tully and they put him at middle linebacker, and they would just blitz him through random gaps and stuff, right? So they're just trying to make offensive line guess wrong. They're trying to use their movement to stop the run, while Notre Dame is going to just say, hey, we are going to run right down your throats, right? And we are going to come right at you, stop it. And so it is also not only a good versus not so good comparison, it's also very different styles of team, right? Like you're talking about a very finesse run defense in USC and a very power-centric, power-heavy running style with Notre Dame, a ton of duo, a ton of inside zone. Like they're going to do those types of things. So just an interesting comparison based upon how these teams also want to win in these areas as well.
And to a degree, I think USC has to do that. Because if you look at their depth chart, Ryan, they're not very big. I mean, I would argue their ends. Well, I mean, not even argue. It's just statistically, it's a fact. Their ends are bigger than their tackles. You know, Nick Figueroa is 200 starting ends. Nick Figueroa is 275 pounds. Thule is 290 pounds. And then their inside guys, Stanley Tuiafo or Tuafo. I'm sorry, I'm not. I really mean no disrespect. I just don't know how to pronounce that. Is 270 pounds, and then Tyrone Taleni is 280 pounds. The only guy that they have inside with any kind of size that plays a lot is Brandon Peely, who's 345 pounds, but he doesn't really move that great. Dejon Benton is 270 pounds. So, I mean, they're a bit of an undersized team, you know, and Shane Lee is big at 245, but, you know, Eric Gentry's 200 pounds. I mean, Raylan Goldforce only 225. They're not a real big team. And so I think they have to do that. Like they don't have the luxury against Notre Dame to play the way that BC did to a degree, but more so how Clemson played. They're going to have to be like Navy. And that's the danger that I think for Notre Dame is if you play your game, you should be okay. But if you have one of those off games like they had against Navy, or if your pass game's not able to really help you out, then that's where you could have some issues for Notre Dame in that you can't really get your offense going. So that's the one danger for Notre Dame is when you are so one-dimensional on offense, if that part of your offense isn't rolling, you can have some problems against a team like USC. But when you look at the statistics, Ryan, obviously in this particular matchup, this is clearly advantage Notre Dame. Even with the overall season numbers, it's clearly advantage Notre Dame. When you take into account what Notre Dame has become, it's a significant advantage for Notre Dame.
Without doubt.
Let's move on to the pass game matchup, Ryan. This is a very intriguing matchup because this is in my opinion, the only bad on bad matchup of the game. Right? USC's not very good at stopping the pass, and Notre Dame's not very good at throwing it. Now, Notre Dame has at times been like, okay, hey, I think they're turning the corner here as a passing offense. We have seen, especially in some of the bigger games for Notre Dame, that they have shown an ability to make some plays through the air. Now, the problem is you just don't know what you're going to get. Obviously, North Carolina was an example where Drew Pine played great. BYU is an example where Drew Pine played great. I thought against Clemson, I thought he made some clutch plays in that game. But you're not going to beat USC, in my opinion. I just don't think it's possible to beat USC going 9 of 17 for 85 yards in the air. I just don't think that's doable. You know, I think at minimum you're going to need something like last week where he hits a couple of throws that he missed. I think is what you're going to need. They're going to need to get something out of their pass game, Ryan, for this to be a game that I think Notre Dame can win, barring their defense forcing a lot of turnovers. But as we're going to get to here in a little bit, that's not exactly something that's very easy to do against this USC offense. So this is the matchup that'll concern you if you're Notre Dame.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because, like you said, there's been glimpses, but it's obviously been super inconsistent from a Notre Dame passing offense perspective. You're facing off against a defense that I would quantify him like this, Brian. I know we talked about it a little bit before the show, but the secondary is talented. I just think that they're just inconsistent right now, right? And we talked a little bit, it's, you know, some age things, right? Like their best player in the secondary, in my opinion, is a true sophomore. I know you mentioned Sierra White, who I also believe is only a sophomore right now. So they're throwing out a lot of younger guys outside of like Max Williams. And so I just think there's a little bit of, not a little bit, there's been a lot of inconsistency with that unit. They've made a lot of big plays, which is quantified by the 18 interceptions that they have caused this year. But then they also have given up a ton of big plays, quantified by the 106th ranking nationally in pass yards let up per game, right? So it's a very feast or famine pass defense, I would say, for USC. Yeah. But for Notre Dame to have an opportunity to win this football game and potentially, kind of hopefully dominates, Notre Dame's passing offense needs to come to play in this game. Because I agree with you. I don't think 9 out of 17 for 80-something yards is going to cut it. I don't. I think that Notre Dame needs to have at least an efficient ability to throw the football in this game. They don't have to throw for 400, but they have to have the threats in general, because you've seen that right now this is not a great pass defense for USC, and this can't be a game where they become a strength. That's the point blank to it.
Yeah, and I think when you look at USC's defense, this epitomizes what we were talking about earlier from Alex Grinch. There are two polar opposites here statistically when you look at this matchup, and that is they rank in the bottom half of the national rankings in yards allowed per game, which my stance on that. I don't put as much on yards per game without context. You need more context, because if they're winning a lot of games big, then guess what? Teams aren't going to throw as much. But then the other part of it is style of play. What do our other teams just, built to throw the ball more, all those type of things. But when you look at it, their yards allowed per attempt is very low. They give up a lot of yards per attempt. They're in the bottom half of the country in yards allowed per completion. They're in the bottom half of the country in efficiency defense. And then lo and behold, they lead the nation in interceptions, and they're 12th in sacks. And that's kind of what they do. I mean, that's where they're at, Ryan. And it's that it's not even out. You call it opportunistic. I call it just risky. It's just they're gonna do a lot of stuff, and if it works, they're gonna shut you down. And if it doesn't work, or if your quarterback doesn't handle it, or whatever the case may be, then it'll work. And you get kind of these really polar opposite results for them.
Yep.
But you say, well, they have a hard time stopping the pass, but that's the danger of this matchup is Notre Dame has not been a team that is real consistently good at attacking with the pass game. Now, we saw them rip Navy apart in the first half, and then what Navy do with their adjustments? They just did a couple extra pressures and took away the quick game, and all of a sudden Notre Dame couldn't move the football. Uh-huh. And I think that's to me is the danger of this. And you talk about, I think trends are important in football, right? I think how you're playing recently matters. Sure. And if you look at USC in their last five games, Ryan, against Utah, Arizona, Cal, Colorado, and UCLA, so not exactly like a murderer's row of opposition. Mm-hmm. They've given up 328.6 passing yards per game in their last 5 games. They're giving up 8.4 yards per attempt in their last 5 games, and they're giving up 13.0 yards per completion in the last 5 games. So they're heading in the wrong direction. And the only reason that number is not worse is because Colorado only passed for 124 yards and averaged 5.9 yards per attempt, because they're awful.
It's so bad, man. It's so bad.
Yeah. Utah went for 424. Arizona went for 380. Cal went for 406. And then UCLA this past week went for 309. And so –
and Utah and Cal are not built off of being passing offenses either, right? Well, Utah wants to be ground and pound, control. Yeah. Cam Rising makes good decisions. He's not a guy that should be throwing for 400
Here's
yards.
What Utah did the next 4 games. So against USC, 68.9% completions, 424 yards, 9.4 yards per attempt. Here's what they did in the next 4 games. Against Washington State, 175 yards, 63 completions, 6.5 yards per attempt. Against Arizona, 52% completions, 151 yards, 6.0 yards per attempt. Against Stanford, 235 yards, 61.8% completion, 6.9 yards per attempt. And then this past weekend against Oregon, 55.3 completion percentage, 170 yards, 4.5 yards per attempt, 0 touchdowns, 4 picks.
Yeah.
So to your point, the only other team that they really threw the ball well on, the only other teams they've thrown the ball well on besides USC is they went for 287 against UCLA's pass defense, which, as you and I saw on Saturday, isn't very good, and have seen throughout the year isn't very good, which is ultimately why we picked USC. We wanted to pick UCLA, but the reason we couldn't do it is because the quarterback, I didn't trust the quarterback to make game-winning plays. But number two, they don't have their defense is not good, especially their pass defense is not good. And then they had 260 yards against Arizona State, who's not very good. And then they had 352 yards against Southern Utah. But they went for 6.8 in a win in a loss to Florida. And, they're not a great passing offense, Utah. And they went for 424 against USC's defense. So to your point, they're giving up yards in ways where you're like, man, like these aren't even teams that are necessarily great at throwing a football. I mean, they give up 400 yards to Cal. The next week against Oregon State, Cal goes for 147. Right? I mean, so yeah, you're correct, Ryan. They're not trending in the right direction, and they're been especially getting gashed lately. And why does that matter? Because what you often see, and this happened with Notre Dame and Brian Van Gorder. If you remember in 2016 for Notre Dame, 2014, excuse me, for Notre Dame, when you looked at early in the season, Notre Dame's defense looked pretty good, right? They, beat Rice and, gave up a lot of yards. Beat Rice, didn't give up a lot of yards or points, right? That game was a blowout. Then the next game, you beat Michigan 31-0. You only give up 289 yards. The next game, you beat Purdue 30-14. You only give up 290 yards. You beat Syracuse the next week, give up 429 yards, but only 15 points, and Syracuse got some yards late. The next week against Stanford in a win, you give up only 205 yards. And then that's when the wheels came off. 5-16 to North Carolina. You give up 31 points to Florida State, 454 against Navy, 412 against Arizona State, 547 against Northwestern, a team that had never gone even to 400 at that point in time of the season. 409 to Louisville, who had a freshman quarterback at the time named Reggie Bonifant, who eventually moved to wide receiver. And then you gave up
playing running back in the NFL right
exactly. Now. You gave up 577 yards to USC and then 436 to LSU. And that year that USC had 577 yards on Notre Dame, Steve Sarkisian called off the dogs. If you go back and watch that game, he could have scored 70 on Notre Dame that game. And he respectfully respected the rivalry and was like, this is a wounded team. They're very beat up. We're not going to embarrass them, right? And kudos to him because he could have. And then Brian Kelly returned that favor in 2017 because Chip Long wanted to put about 2-3 more touchdowns on USC in 2017. And Brian Kelly was like, no, we're not running it up on them because he remembered what they knew that USC, they went on like this 12-minute drive at one point in time. Remember that game with Max Whittikin as the backup quarterback?
Yep.
So what happened? Injuries set. Well, injuries didn't really set into like Louisville. What happened before? Teams finally had now we have 5 games of film on this guy. We've figured his tendencies out. We know what he's going to do on third down. We know what he likes to do. We know where his pressures are going to come from. And now we're going to rip it up. And that's what Notre Dame needs to do in this game. Look, I'm not saying, Ryan, they got to throw for 300 yards. I'm not saying that. If they throw for 300 yards, they're going to win this game in a blowout, in my opinion. But I don't see that happening. Notre Dame hasn't thrown for 300 yards all game or all season. Which is just nuts to say to me. I'm sorry. I think that's nutty to say that they've only gone over 270 yards once all year, but that's a different conversation for a different day. But we've seen Drew Pine against this kind of secondary in the past have some success, and at least for a half. And that's what he's going to have to do. They're going to have to do some stuff early that Tommy Rees is going to have to generate some things early, Ryan, that get Drew comfortable and let USC know you can't just heat our run game up because we're going to have this for you that's going to make you pay. And if they can do that, then they should be able to score a lot. Because I don't think this is going to be a 2017 game. I don't think this is a game you can score 21 offensive points and win like you did against Clemson. Because you can't bank on a blocked punt for a touchdown and an interception at the 11. You can't, a pick six, an interception at the 11 that also sets up another touchdown. You're going to have to move the ball. You're going to have to score.
Right. And it's going to be really interesting too, Brian, because I'm looking forward to seeing what Tommy Rees does early on in this football game because, to your point, you need to get Drew in some type of rhythm. You need to in this football game. And the one thing that USC has done well, aside from getting forced turnovers, is they have gotten after the quarterback pretty well. I mean, you look at that number, they have 33 sacks on the season, which ranks 12th in the nation right now. I mentioned Tooley before. I mean, he's got 11 sacks on the season. Hunter Echols, who was a former pretty good recruit, has kind of been around the block a little bit at a couple different programs, has had his flashes at times. We mentioned Eric Gentry. They're going to bring some pressure from the second level as well. But I really think that this is a game where, again, I know we talk about this every week, and we're not going to talk about keys to victory as much during the show. But the offensive line, I think, really just has to do well against this defensive front because they might not be big, might not be great against the run, but what they can do is they can move and they get after the passer a little bit. So just looking at that sack number for USC, that's a matchup where, because Notre Dame has been pretty good with not allowing a ton of pressure, with not allowing a ton of sacks, but now they're going against a team that's kind of how they make their living defensively, is being able to force pressure and being able to force turnovers.
Let's go to the next matchup, Ryan. That's going to be the Notre Dame scoring offense against the USC scoring defense. And again, this is where it starts to even out, right? And this is where you say, okay, this is going to make it this interesting. Notre Dame ranks higher in points per game and USC, points allowed. Notre Dame ranks higher in yards per play. USC is better in the red zone. Notre Dame is significantly better in third down offense compared to their third down defense. And then the turnover aspect is very, very fascinating, Ryan, because Notre Dame turned the ball over 3 times in the first 2 games. They turned it over 3 times against Marshall. They turned it over twice against Stanford, twice against UNLV. Really, since then, they've been pretty good, I think, about not turning the ball over. You had the one turnover against Syracuse, which was just not a good turnover, but it ended up not proving detrimental. You had the turnover against Navy, and then you had the turnover last week against Boston College. And I'm even trying to remember what that one was. You had a lost fumble. Oh, it was on a punt. It wasn't even the Notre Dame offense. It was on a punt return from Matt Salerno. So,
oh yes, yep,
yeah. Because I'm like, I don't remember the offense turning the ball over. They scored on their first 8 possessions. But when this team protects the football, Ryan, they're pretty good. Well, USC is really good at forcing turnovers, and that to me is the concern I have. Is if USC can get Drew Pine kind of a little rattled, get him rushing throws, getting, if he's stepping into the pocket. Look, USC is they're going to get their hands up. They're going to do what every other team has done. They're going to try to tip a pass and get an interception. And they've had a lot of those type of picks this year, Ryan, a lot of those kind of tip pass interceptions, which is good. That's one good thing they do. They clearly practice that type of stuff, but you can't have Drew Pine making those kind of mistakes in this game. You can't. You have to play clean, and that to me is the biggest part of this matchup. And Notre Dame's red zone offense has gotten better and better and better all throughout the year. It's now in the top 25 nationally. USC's not very good, so when you get in the red zone, touchdowns they have to be touchdowns, right? That's going to be a key too. You're not going to beat USC kicking a bunch of field goals. So this is the interesting part. I mean, I think advantage for Notre Dame in the run game. I think the pass game is even statistically. I think Notre Dame has a personnel advantage on the skill positions. It really comes down to Drew Pine, and I think the same thing is true here. Notre Dame has a talent advantage over USC's defense everywhere except one position, and that's the big question mark. That's quarterback. And so this game really, and I hate to put this kind of pressure on it, but this game really hinges on Tommy Rees being able to get Drew Pine comfortable, and then Drew going out and making the reads and making the throws, executing his technique, staying back in the pocket, getting the ball out, not forcing mistakes, not doing some of the things that can get him in trouble. If he can play clean, this Notre Dame's going to score points. Will it be enough to win? That we don't know, and that we'll discuss more on Friday. But it'll certainly give them a chance to score enough to be in the game in the fourth quarter, and that's really where you want to be, because that's when you can wear USC down, hopefully, and put the game away. But that's going to be the key. Drew Pine's got to play well, and you've got to protect the football. Those are going to be vitally important in this game, because USC forces a lot of turnovers, and we'll see in a little bit, they don't turn it over themselves.
No, they don't. I mean, we'll get into that obviously, but I'm pretty sure Caleb Williams only has 2 interceptions on the year or something like that, like 3 interceptions. Yeah, so
he threw a third this past weekend against UCLA. Right. So that was what you're looking at what his numbers were going into that game, Ryan. So
yeah. That was a really bad interception against UCLA, by the way. Number 20 was like an underneath zone. But
you know what I love about him, though, Ryan? Didn't phase him one bit.
At all. No,
I mean, just didn't phase him. Look, guys, you're gonna throw interceptions sometimes. It's like, but you can't let it phase you. And he just came out the next year and was like, I'm fine. I got this. And that's true. That's what I love about watching a kid play. I really do. Like, I hate USC. Okay, they're a rival, but I also love talented football players and good football players, and that kid's a really good football player.
He's a stud, man. He's a
we'll get into him here in a little bit, but yeah.
Well, the one thing I was going to say that worries me a little bit about USC's defense, and it all goes hand in hand, right? We talked about the forced turnovers. You talk about the sacks. Well, what causes that to happen? You mentioned some tip passes. Well, they have good length on that unit overall, right? They do. Tully is 6'4" with pretty long arms, playing one defensive end. Hunter Eccles is a pretty long kid at 6'4". He's a little bit more of a lighter stand-up rusher, but he's got length for him. Eric Gentry is the weirdest body type I've ever seen of a linebacker at 6'6", 200, but the one thing he has, he's got length. No doubt about that. Kalen Bullock.
Solomon Bird's going to play a lot as well at end as a rotation. He's 6'5", 6'4". Nick Figueroa is 6'5". He's not real athletic, but he's long. You know?
He's long. Kalen Bullock, their best safety, is 6'3". He's a longer guy. Mekhi Blackman, cornerback, is 6 foot with decent length. I mean, so they have length on that level. So for me, Notre Dame needs to be crisp. They need to get the ball out on time, and that all comes back to the quarterback. It does, right? Like, you need to be able to get through your reads quickly, get the ball out, not telegraph passes, not stare stuff down. You need to get the ball out fast, because that's where that length really starts to hurt you, is when you double clutch or you're staring things down or you're not sure of where you're going to go with the football. Those things happen, and ball security just in general, and this is past Drew Pine for a second, is going to be big. We haven't talked at all about Audric Estime in recent weeks from a negative perspective, because he's kind of cleaned up the fumbling issue he had during the middle of the season, right? So that needs to continue. Notre Dame can't shoot themselves in the foot against this team, because you don't want to give their offense extra possessions. Like, that is the worst thing that you can do against USC, is give them extra possessions. This is a team that is built off of, we're going to give the offense the ball as many times as possible. We're going to force 24 turnovers so far this year, and let Caleb Williams and let Jordan Addison and all those dudes go make plays and score points. Right. That's how USC is built off of. So I think being I don't want to say, because I don't want it to be a thing where Notre Dame is tentative offensively, not afraid to take a chance, but also
you got to attack. You just got to play clean. That's really what this isn't about. Conservative football. You're not going to beat them being conservative. And running the ball a ton doesn't equal conservative. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do, right? If they're going to load the box, let's hit Braden Lindsey on a reverse or something like that. Let's beat him with a screen. It's just about, you've got to have a smart game plan that doesn't expose Drew Pine to a lot of the things that he's not good at. He's going to have to do some of that, but don't expose him to a lot of that. And then when you get in those situations, you got to play clean. That's the kryptonite to USC is clean football. Don't give up negatives and don't turn the ball over. That's kryptonite to their defense. I mean, absolute kryptonite, because like you said, that's what they're all about. That's what their defense is all about. And when they don't do that, and they don't force a lot of negatives, they have problems. Here's the deal. Their defense, as we talked about before, let's go back to it. Tackles for loss, they rank 48th in the country. Sacks, they rank 12th. You know how many tackles for loss they had in their one loss this year, Ryan? One against Utah. They had one tackle for loss, and I believe that was a sack, if I remember correctly. No, it was not a sack. So, you had, how many sacks did you have against UCLA? One. Yeah. Right? How many sacks did they have against Oregon State? 0. Right? And so when you look at when this team has struggled, they're not getting pressure. They're not creating negatives. Teams are playing ahead of schedule, and they're able to win games. I mean, Oregon State, right? The reason Oregon State lost that game, 4 turnovers. That's why they lost that game. Utah turned it over once. Why did UCLA lose that game? 4 turnovers. I mean, they turned it over 4 times. USC turned it over, I believe, once? Right? Yes. And they still barely won by 3 points. Over a good UCLA team. But that's the point. The thing is, if you protect the football, Stanford's another example. Stanford did a lot of good things against USC, but what killed them? First long drive of the game, Tanner McKee throws an interception in the end zone. I believe it was off of a tip pass. I believe, right? That's the thing. You're going to move on them, but you got to score. And the teams that Stanford played with USC, but turn the ball over too much. Oregon State outplayed USC, turned the ball over 4 times. Utah didn't. Utah eliminated the negatives against USC. And that's why they were able to score a lot of points. UCLA did in some areas, but the turnovers killed them. You eliminate one of those turnovers, and UCLA likely wins that football game. And that ultimately, Ryan, is why I went with USC, because I didn't think Caleb Williams was going to fold, and I thought that the other kid was going to make those kind of mistakes. He's had a heck of a year. I don't take anything away from him, but I just, in this kind of game, he's just I just don't think he's good enough. If it comes down to Caleb Williams versus Dorian Thompson-Robinson, I'm taking Caleb Williams every day of the week. You could say the same thing about this matchup, but the difference is Notre Dame is not as dependent on Drew Pine as UCLA is on Dorian Thompson-Robinson to be a playmaker.
That's true.
And that's the difference.
And if I could add one last thing, Brian, I think that you mentioned it a little bit there, but you need to finish drives in the end zone. That's like another big thing, right? Is that USC is going to score, guys, right? Like they are. Notre Dame's not going to shut out USC. Like, can we just start there, right? And it was awesome seeing Blake Grupe get back on a good track last week, right? 3 for 3 field goal, 7 for 7 on all his kicks. It was great because he's been struggling. But this is not a game where you're going to win by kicking field goals. And we see by these rankings, USC has struggled keeping teams out of the end zone when they got into the red zone. And Notre Dame has started to really push that envelope to the right direction, ranking 25th with their touchdown percentage. So when Notre Dame gets those opportunities, because they will have those opportunities, in my opinion, they have to finish drives. They have to. Against this type of offense the USC has, field goals are not going to win this football game.